Okay, so with that in mind, from the previous video's introduction, uh, let's get started taking a look at this. And I'm going to say it again because it's so important. Shakespeare did not have a sister, but Virginia Woolf imagines what it would be like if Shakespeare did have a sister. And that imagining isn't just like, oh, I'm just going to make a story up for fun. She's imagining it because a bishop, a dead bishop, claimed that no woman in Shakespeare's lifetime could have had Shakespeare's genius. And she imagines Shakespeare's sister in order to answer that question. Because imagining things, novels, poetry, movies, music, is a type, if it's done well, it's a type of thinking. A lot of movies, by the way, are just roller coasters and they're not thinking at all. And that's one of the reasons why I get annoyed seeing certain kinds of movies that I will not name. Because I don't want to shit on anybody's idea of a good time, but sometimes I get bored during movies because they're very entertaining while you're watching them, but you know, there's nothing to think about. When they're over, and that's the end of it. It's boring. Um, so a lot of movies are just primarily roller coasters or advertisements for the next movie. Um, yeah. Okay. So let's take a look at what Virginia Woolf actually wrote. So here we go. Yep. Okay. Hold on. All right. So this is Virginia Woolf. Um, she writes, "Let us imagine, since facts are so hard to come by, what would have happened had Shakespeare had a wonderfully gifted sister called Judith, let us say. Um, Shakespeare himself went, very probably, his mother was an heiress, to grammar school where he may have learned Latin. Ovid, Virgil, and Horace. Now, Ovid, Virgil, and Horace are some of the most famous and important ancient poets. Um, I actually don't know much about Horace, who I don't care about. But Ovid and Virgil I know quite well. Ovid wrote a book called The Metamorphosis, which is about the gods changing. It's about things that it's about gods that take animal forms and people that get cursed and transformed into animals and transformed into different kinds of objects and plants and shit. A lot of the mythology you're familiar with from the ancient world comes from Ovid. Stories about kind of, a woman has a weaving competition with a goddess and she's so good and the goddess is bad, so she turns into a spider, and that's where spiders come from. It's that kind of thing. And Virgil wrote about the founding of an empire. So she says Shakespeare himself went, very probably. His mother was an heiress to the grammar school where he may have learned Latin, Ovid, Virgil, and Horace, and the elements of grammar and logic. He was, it is well known, a wild boy who poached rabbits, perhaps shot a deer, and had, rather than sooner than he should have done, to marry a woman in the neighborhood who bore him a child rather quicker than was right. Shakespeare met a young woman and well, an older woman actually, but he fell in love with her, and they got married and had a kid pretty quick. Um, that escapade sent him to seek his fortune in London, right? He had to make money because he had a wife and kid now. He had, it seemed, a taste for the theater. He began by holding horses at the stage door. Now, I don't know how to emphasize this enough. She's kind of making this up. She's just sort of imagining what his life was probably like based on what we know. It's not that she's for sure wrong, but like, did Shakespeare hold horses for people at the? She's just imagining. But again, this imagining is a form of thinking. So she says, um, uh, very soon he got work in the theater and became a successful actor and lived at the hub of the universe, meeting everybody and knowing everybody, practicing his art, that's theater, on the boards. That's an old-fashioned word for the boards are the stage floor. I feel like there's a similar phrase for a basketball court, but I can't remember what it is off the top of my head. Maybe somebody can tell me. Um, but she says she practices. So Shakespeare, he very soon got work in the theater and became a successful actor and lived at the hub of the universe, meeting everybody, knowing everybody, practicing his art on the boards, right? He got to practice theater on the stage, exercising his wits in the street, and even getting access to the palace of the queen, right? He got to kind of adventure around. Meanwhile, his extraordinarily gifted sister, let us suppose, remained at home. See, that let us suppose means we're just imagining what she would be like if she existed, but she didn't. She was as adventurous, as imaginative, as agog, meaning excited. She was as agog to see the world as he was. But she was not sent to school. She had no chance of learning grammar and logic, let alone of reading Horace and Virgil. She picked up a book now and then, one of her brothers perhaps, and read a few pages, but then her parents came in and told her to mend the stockings or mind the stew and not moon about with books and papers. Moon about means just like to stare aimlessly. Um, they would have spoken sharply but kindly, for they were substantial people who knew the conditions of life for a woman and loved their daughter. Indeed, more likely than not, she was the apple of her father's eye. Right. So this is not a story about how her parents hated her and locked her up and were, they liked her. They thought, they think she's a great kid, but they're looking out for her, and so this is how they treat her. Um, Perhaps she scribbled some pages up in an attic loft on the sly. Right. She secretly wrote some stuff, but was careful to hide them or set fire to them. Soon, however, before she was out of her teens, she was to be betrothed, that's married, to the son of a neighboring wool stapler, so just some kind of, local yokel, farmer guy, sheep guy. She cried out that marriage was hateful to her, and for that she was severely beaten by her father. Then he ceased to scold her. He begged her instead not to hurt him, not to shame him in this matter of her marriage. He would give her a chain of beads, or a fine petticoats, or clothes and jewelry, he said, and there were tears in his eyes. How could she disobey him? How could she break his heart? The force of her own gift alone drove her to it, right? Because she's a great artist, and so she's sensitive to other people, just like we learned from Wordsworth. And so when her father's upset, she feels it. She made up a small parcel of her belongings, let herself down by the rope one summer's night, and took the road to London. She was not 17. The birds that sang in the hedge were not more musical than she was, right? She has a great gift for writing beautiful words like birds. She had the quickest fancy. Fancy there means imagination. She had the quickest fancy, gift like her brothers, for the tune of words. Like him, she had a taste for theater. She stood at the stage door. She wanted to act, she said. Men laughed in her face. The manager, a fat, loose-lipped man, guffawed, right? He laughed, wah, 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 wah. He bellowed something about poodles dancing and women acting, meaning he feels like that's the same thing, that a female, remember we talked about this in class, I think we did, but then in Shakespeare's day, all the roles on stage, all the female roles were played by men. You had young boys would be all the women on stage because women weren't allowed to be in the theater, because they thought it was an immoral place for a woman to be. People really thought theater was dangerous, not only because of sort of there's drug use and people are fucking each other, but also like they thought that if you spent too much time in your imagination, it would make you go crazy. They thought there was a similarity between like the kind of like spending time in fantasy worlds, they thought maybe would blur into schizophrenia and psychosis pretty quickly. We tend to make a clear, we tend to feel pretty safe about, well, this over here is an imaginary friend that my little child has and he likes to hang out with when he's lonely, and this person over here is psychotic. But they were sort of worried that too much time, they believed women were, not as strong as men and couldn't handle it, and they would sort of go insane if they were in the theater too long. It was really just a way to control women. So Virginia Woolf says, um, uh, this guy, this manager, compares women acting to poodles dancing, right? Maybe it's a trick they can do, but it's a ridiculous, silly trick. It's not real art. It's like something in a circus, like a freak. No woman, he said, could possibly be an actress. He hinted, you can imagine what, and she doesn't say what, but what's being hinted there is that maybe if she had sex with him, he would let her be in the theater. This is the kind of, and by the way, this is an idea that still exists in sort of modern day Hollywood. This Harvey Weinstein, the whole thing there was that he said, oh, I'll make you're a beautiful woman and I'll make you famous and put you in a movie, but you have to sleep with me first. So this is the same thing Virginia Woolf imagines that Shakespeare's sister would have to put up with if she tried to become a theater person like her brother. Could she even, she could get no training in her craft. Could she even seek her dinner in a tavern or roam the streets at midnight? Yet her genius was for fiction and lusted to feed abundantly on the lives of men and women and the study of their ways. At last, for she was very young, oddly like Shakespeare the poet in her face with the same green eyes and rounded brows, at last Nick Green, the actor-manager, took pity on her. She found herself with child by that gentleman, and so, who shall measure the heat and violence of the poet's heart when caught and entangled in a woman's body? killed herself one winter's night and lies buried at some crossroads where the omnibuses now stop outside the Elephant and Castle. Right, so she tried to get in the theater and she couldn't, and she met someone and fell in love passionately and had a child and was miserable and committed suicide. And now that was 400 years ago, and now it's just some street where buses drive down. And there's the Elephant and Castle is like a tavern. So kind of a depressing story that Virginia Woolf tells. It's extra depressing when you discover that Virginia Woolf herself committed suicide, which is just like, oof, it's a lot to deal with. So trigger warning suicide, I guess, but suicide. Go if you need help. There's helplines for that kind of thing. Virginia Woolf did not have access to those kinds of services, and we're working on making things better for folks struggling with those kinds of issues. But I will see you guys in the next video.